Something is happening. Not in the realms of the spectacular, not with trumpets or dramatic apparitions that interrupt the ordinary course of things. Something much more subtle and therefore much more difficult to deny. A quality of presence that certain souls begin to perceive in the spiritual field that surrounds them, which has no identifiable origin in the physical senses, which does not correspond to any category of everyday experience, but which is unmistakable for those who have begun to develop the necessary sensitivity to perceive it. A quality of heat that does not come from any thermal source. A quality of light that does not come from any light source. A quality of guidance that was not produced by thought, but comes to thought from a place beyond thought. Rudolf Steiner, in the last years of his life, with an insistence that grew as the time to convey what he had perceived became increasingly scarce, said this with the clarity that was characteristic of him. This is already happening. The Christ is returning. Not in the sense that the apocalyptic tradition of popular Christianity imagined, not as a singular event in the future that would put an end to history, not as a physical apparition that everyone would see with their physical eyes, but as a process that had already begun, that was intensifying, and that human beings who developed the appropriate organs of perception could directly verify. The statement is extraordinary. And Steiner knew it was extraordinary. He knew that most who heard it, even among his most serious students, would have difficulty receiving it with the seriousness it deserved without slipping into one of two typical errors: the credulous enthusiasm that accepts without checking and turns spiritual knowledge into substanceless devotional belief, or the reflexive skepticism that discards before examining. To avoid both, he crafted his statement with a precision and richness of detail that few of his contemporaries, and few who studied his work after him, could fully match. What he was describing was not a prophecy in the conventional religious sense. It was the result of spiritual research that he had conducted over decades with the same rigor he applied to any other investigation, and what that research had revealed about the nature and timing of what he called the return of the Christ in the etheric world is one of the most specific and consequential revelations in all of spiritual science. Sometimes what you call a coincidence is exactly what should make you stop and pay attention. There is an invisible line connecting everything you've experienced so far, and when you start to see that, nothing will ever be the same again. Most people go through this moment and simply ignore it. Others decide to go deeper. If something inside has awakened, maybe it's time to follow that path. The next step is in the first link pinned in the comments or description. To understand what Steiner meant by the etheric world, it is necessary to understand the structure of reality that spiritual science describes, a structure that includes, in addition to the physical plane that the senses directly perceive, at least three other planes that coexist with the physical, and that interpenetrate everything that exists on the physical plane. The closest to the physical, which is in a sense the living substrate of the physical, is the etheric world, the plane of vital forces, of biological rhythms, of the forces of growth and regeneration that keep living organisms in their form and that death dissolves. The etheric world is not a place separate from the physical world. It permeates the physical world. It is present in every living organism as the vital dimension that distinguishes it from inorganic matter. And the human being, while alive, has an etheric body that interpenetrates and sustains his physical body, the vital dimension of his being which carries the etheric memory of everything that has been experienced and that death finally releases into the spiritual cosmos. The Christ who returns in the etheric world is not, therefore, the Christ who returns from some distant place to appear on the physical plane. It is the Christ whose forces have become progressively more present on the etheric plane of earth, on the plane that is the vital substrate of all physical existence, that permeates everything that lives, that is the field in which life and death meet. And as what Steiner was asserting, based on his direct spiritual perception and with the specificity of someone who is describing a process he observed, not speculating about what might happen, is that the Christ forces that had been deposited in the spiritual field of the earth through Golgotha were, from approximately 1933 onwards, becoming increasingly active in the etheric field specifically, in a way that made it possible for certain souls to perceive them more directly than had been possible before. Why 1933? Steiner had identified, based on the laws that govern the evolutionary cycles that spiritual science describes, a period of approximately 2,000 years that had begun with Golgotha, and that would correspond to what the Christian tradition described as the era of the Holy Spirit, the period in which the forces that Christ deposited on earth would be progressively revealing themselves to human souls that developed the ability to perceive them. 2,000 years after Golgotha roughly corresponds to the 21st century, but the process of intensification preceding its peak had begun earlier, and Steiner placed the beginning of this specific intensification in the etheric field around 1933. Not that 1933 was the only milestone. There were anticipations and developments before and after. But it was the point at which the process reached a threshold of intensity that made what was previously perceived only by the most developed progressively accessible to an increasing number of souls who were in a position to perceive. The historical irony, which Steiner could not have calculated as he died in 1925, is that 1933 was precisely the year in which Hitler came to power in Germany, the beginning of the period of greatest expression of Ahrimanic forces that humanity had experienced. The intensification of the forces of Christ and the intensification of the forces that oppose Christ occur simultaneously. It is the nature of evolutionary processes that resistance intensifies in proportion to what it resists. The same period that saw Nazism and Stalinism in Hiroshima also saw the beginning of a spiritual opening that, in often unspectacular ways, was progressively making it possible for increasing numbers of human beings to perceive what had previously been beyond the limits of ordinary perception. What this perception is, how it manifests itself in souls that are sufficiently developed to receive it, is the most concrete and directly relevant question of the whole description. Steiner was very precise about this, precisely because he knew that any statement about the perception of Christ without specifying what is being asserted is an open door to all kinds of illusion and spiritual self-deception. What he was describing was neither the dramatic vision of the Christ appearing visibly before the physical senses, which would be a form of perception that most souls are not in a position to have, that would not be characteristic of this specific event, and that, if it occurred, could be confused with other forms of spiritual appearance that do not have the quality of the Christ, nor the vague impression of a presence that could be anything. What Steiner described is something with a very precise specificity, the etheric perception of Christ, which occurs on the threshold between sleep and the waking state, which has the quality of a knowledge that arrives from outside the self but is received within consciousness, which is not imposed, but which, when it occurs, is unmistakable due to the specific quality of what it brings. A quality that Steiner tried to describe with the Greek word gnosis, not in the heretical sense, but in the precise sense. Direct knowledge, not mediated by concepts or arguments of a reality that is more fundamental than any factual information. The knowledge that Christ is present, not as a belief, not as a conclusion to a reasoning, but as an immediate perception that imposes itself with the certainty that only direct experience can produce. Steiner had articulated with special care the difference between this genuine perception and its imitations, which were what worried him most about the announcement of Christ's return in the ether. For where there is a genuine spiritual reality, there are also forces that produce imitations of that reality, forces that Steiner identified with Lucifer and the subtler dimensions of Ahrimanic influence. The Luciferic imitation of the return of the Christ would be the experience of emotional elevation, of spiritual ecstasy, of a sense of divine presence that is actually the product of psychological states produced by the desiring self rather than the product of genuine perception. And Ahrimanic imitation would be the experience of a rigid certainty about what one is perceiving, the conviction that one has received a revelation that eliminates the need for further development, that ends the process of searching rather than deepening it. The genuine perception of the Christ in the ether has characteristics opposite to those of its imitations. It increases humility instead of increasing spiritual pride. It intensifies the capacity for love rather than producing a feeling of being especially loved. It deepens the need for development rather than producing the feeling that development is complete. It produces greater clarity about what still needs to be worked on within oneself, rather than greater certainty about what others need to change. These characteristics, which Steiner described as the verification sign of the genuineness of the experience, they are the criterion that allows us to distinguish what is real from what is an illusion in this domain. And it is a criterion that anyone honest enough with themselves can apply. The question of who is in a position to have this perception, and the question of what makes a soul capable of perceiving what other souls do not, is central to understanding what Steiner was describing and what he saw as humanity's most urgent task in this period. He was very clear that the perception of the Christ in the ether is not a gift that the cosmos distributes randomly or as a reward for good religious conduct. It is the result of a development, long, non-linear, demanding, that makes the soul progressively more transparent to what the Earth's etheric field carries. And this development can occur within any spiritual tradition, or outside any tradition, in any culture, at any historical time. What matters is not the religious label, but the quality of the inner development that has been accomplished. More specifically, Steiner saw three conditions as particularly determining for the etheric perception of the Christ to become possible. The first is the development of living thought, the kind of thought that Steiner described as the participation of individual consciousness in the thinking activity of logos, as distinct from ordinary representational thought that operates with static images and concepts. Living thought is not a state of enlightenment that is achieved all at once. It is a practice that is cultivated, which requires the discipline of maintaining attention on an object of meditation without losing active presence, which progressively modifies the structure of the etheric field in a way that makes it more transparent to the activity of the logos. The second condition is the transformation of emotional life, the progressive liberation of emotions from their automatic patterns of reactivity so that they can function as organs of perception, instead of simply as reactions to what pleases and what displeases. This transformation is not the emptying of emotions or their suppression. It is their education, the development of the capacity to feel in a way that perceives the spiritual qualities of situations and beings, rather than simply registering pleasure and displeasure. And the third condition is what Steiner called moral strength, the ability to act based on what is recognized as good, regardless of what circumstances recommend or what personal interest favors. This moral force, when genuinely developed, creates in the human etheric field a quality that Steiner saw as especially receptive to the forces of the Christ, an openness that comes not from passivity, but from the activity of the deepest self. The return of the Christ in the ether is, therefore, an event that has two sides. The objective side, which is the actual intensification of the Christ's forces in the Earth's etheric field, a process that, according to Steiner, is occurring independently of any human perception of it, and the subjective side, which is the development of human souls that reach the point where this intensification can be perceived. And the relationship between the two sides is not the relationship between a passive receiver and a signal that arrives independently. It is a relationship of encounter, of resonance, of mutual activation. The forces of Christ in the ether are most effective in souls who have developed the capacity to receive them. And the souls who have developed this capacity are more capable precisely because the forces of Christ are more present in the Earth's etheric field than they were in previous times. This has an implication that is at once deeply encouraging and deeply demanding, that the spiritual development that makes the realization of the Christ possible is not just something that humans do for their own good, it is also a contribution to the process of intensification that the return of the Christ represents. Each soul that becomes more transparent to the Logos, that more fully develops living thought and emotional perception and moral strength, that soul is contributing to the Earth's etheric field being progressively more permeable to the forces of the Christ, that the return is progressively more real, that more souls can perceive what is happening. It is one of the most concrete formulations of what it means to consciously collaborate with the evolutionary development of humanity. Steiner identified the period between Golgotha and our time as the period of preparation for this return, the period in which the forces of the Christ, deposited in the spiritual field of the earth, were progressively infiltrating the etheric field in a way that would make possible the event he announced. And he identified our period, the decade since 1933 and especially the 21st century, as the period when the threshold had been reached, when what was being prepared was reaching maturity, in which the conditions for the direct encounter between the human soul and the Christ in the ether were, for the first set of sufficiently developed souls, finally present. Christian tradition had spoken of a second advent of Christ, a second coming that different interpretations, situated in very different ways, but which they all agreed was a future event of great magnitude. Steiner was not denying this second advent. He was reinterpreting its nature in a way that spiritual science allows and that conventional theology had not achieved. The second advent is not a repetition of the first advent on a larger scale. It is not another physical incarnation, which would be spiritually impossible, because the Logos, by incarnating once in Jesus of Nazareth, performed a unique and unrepeatable act that permanently modified the relations between spirit and matter. The second advent is, precisely, the return in the ether, the Logos that had incarnated in the densest matter and when dying had mixed its forces with the spiritual substance of the earth, now returning on the plane closer to the physical than the physical, the etheric plane, in a way that is perceptible, not by physical eyes, but by the eyes of the ether, which some souls already possess, and which others are in the process of developing. This realization that the second advent is already happening, that it is a process and not a singular event, that it is perceivable in ways that conventional faith did not need to be perceptible, but that spiritual development makes increasingly directly accessible, is one of the most radical revelations in all of spiritual science. And it is also one of the most fraught with practical consequences, precisely because it does not place the encounter with Christ in an indefinite future in which external conditions will finally be favorable, but in the present, in a present that is waiting for internal conditions to be developed. Not everyone notices when life starts whispering answers, but whoever notices knows. There is a moment when continuing to ignore it is more expensive than finding out. You can close this now and carry on as usual, or you can choose to understand what is behind everything that has been troubling you. The decision seems small, but it can completely change the course of your journey. If it makes sense to you, the next step is at the first link pinned in the comments or description. Steiner had articulated, with a seriousness that left no doubt about how urgent he considered the issue, that the greatest threat to the return of Christ in the ether was not the incredulity of materialists, which was understandable and which evolution would eventually overcome. It was the possibility that the event would be misinterpreted, that souls who began to notice something unusual in the etheric field around them would attribute this event to a specific human being who proclaimed himself to be the Christ, to a charismatic leader who used religious language to capture souls who were genuinely seeking the sacred. Steiner made explicit warnings about this in several conferences, that in the 20th and 21st centuries, figures would appear who would proclaim to be the reincarnated Christ, and that these proclamations would be false no matter how convincing they were, because the Christ will not be reincarnated in physical form. What is occurring is the return in the ether, which does not have a physical face, which cannot be pinpointed and identified with a specific human being. These warnings, which 20th century history has confirmed as surprisingly accurate, with countless figures proclaiming themselves to be the Christ, or to be the Messiah, or to be the incarnation of the divine, reveal something about Steiner's understanding that is more important than the specific content of the warnings. The understanding that spiritual development without discernment is more dangerous than no development at all, that openness to the sacred without the ability to distinguish the genuine from the false is an openness to anything, that the Christ who perceives himself in the ether is unmistakable precisely because its specific characteristics are radically incompatible with any form of charismatic leadership that uses the adoration of followers as a power resource. The Christ that Steiner saw returning in the ether is the being that represents, on the cosmic plane, human freedom, which is the antithesis of any relationship of dependence, of any structure in which one human being needs another to reach the sacred. The Christ in the ether does not create disciples in the sense of beings who depend on a master. He creates souls who become progressively freer, more capable of self-checking, more guided by the deeper self that has developed throughout all incarnations and which, upon receiving the logos that the Earth's etheric field carries, becomes more completely what it genuinely is. What happens to the souls who have realized, even partially? What did Steiner describe? What changes when the etheric perception of the Christ begins to become real? Steiner described specific transformations that were not dramatic from an external point of view, but that were profoundly real from the point of view of inner development. A change in the relationship with suffering, not that the suffering diminishes or disappears, but that your relationship with suffering is transformed, that it becomes something that can be crossed from within rather than simply suffered passively. A change in relationship to time, a quality of presence that begins to include a dimension that transcends immediate time, a sense that what is happening now has meaning that goes beyond what the short-term perspective can see. A modification in the relationship with others, a growing ability to find in each human being the thread of spiritual essence that connects him to the same logos, which makes it progressively more difficult to treat any human being as less than a spiritual being in the process of development. These modifications, subtle, nonlinear, easily confused with simple psychological maturation by those who do not know the spiritual perspective that allows them to be identified for what they are the signs that Steiner identified as characteristic of the soul that is progressively being touched by the forces of Christ in the ether. Not dramatic visions, not special powers, not states of ecstasy that separate the percipient from the ordinary world, but precisely the opposite, a growing capacity to be more fully present to the ordinary world, to perceive its spiritual dimension from within rather than from some special state, to find the sacred in the texture of the everyday rather than needing to step outside the everyday to find it. This is happening. Not uniformly, not in all souls simultaneously, not as an event that everyone perceives at the same time, but as a process. The process that Steiner was describing when he said that the return of the Christ in the ether had already begun. That is intensifying. That is reaching progressively more souls as the collective spiritual development of humanity advances. That is transforming the spiritual field of the earth in ways that the ordinary eye does not perceive, but that developed spiritual perception can directly verify. And the invitation that Steiner made throughout his work, and which the return of Christ in the ether makes more urgent and more directly achievable than at any previous time, is the invitation to development, to create, through the inner work that spiritual science describes, the conditions so that what is happening in the etheric field can be perceived, so that the return that is already underway can not only be announced from the outside, but verified from the inside, so that each soul that perceives what is happening becomes, through this perception, a more living presence of the Logos in the world, and contributes, through the quality of its development, to the process deepening and reaching more souls, This is already happening. The question is just whether you will recognize what is happening when you start to notice it. The question of time, of when and how Christ's return in the ether intensifies, has dimensions that Steiner elaborated with a specificity that goes beyond what most of his commentators have paid sufficient attention to. He described the process not as a linear progression in which intensity simply increases steadily, but as a process that follows the cosmic rhythms that spiritual science identifies, rhythms that have moments of greatest openness and moments of greatest resistance, that correspond to configurations of humanity's collective development, that spiritual perception can identify, but that conventional historical analysis rarely reaches. One of these rhythms that Steiner identified as especially relevant to the return of Christ in the ether was the 33-year cycle, the same number of years that corresponded to the lifespan of Jesus of Nazareth. Every 33 years, according to Steiner, the spiritual field of the earth goes through a configuration in which the forces of Christ are especially active, in which the conditions for the encounter between the developed human consciousness and the logos in the ether are especially favorable. These 33-year cycles do not produce visible external events that can be easily identified in history. Their nature is spiritual, operating in the etheric field in ways that affect the development of souls, but that rarely translate into unique, dramatic events. But they profoundly affect the spiritual conditions in which developing souls find themselves. Steiner had also described the conditions of collective development that create the context for return. Humanity, in its Eve process elutive, was going through the period in which the conquest of intellectual consciousness, which had required the progressive closing of the channels of instinctive spiritual perception that previous epochs possessed, was reaching its natural limit. The self that had been developed by intellectual consciousness, firm, individual, capable of independent thought, was the necessary precondition for the encounter with the Christ in the ether to be genuine rather than dependent. The self that encounters the Christ in etheric awareness must be a sufficiently developed self, so that the encounter is an encounter between two beings, not the dissolution of a fragile self into an overwhelming presence. And this self was, in Steiner's time and even more so in our time, sufficiently developed, in an increasing number of soul, for genuine encounter to become possible. But the achievement of intellectual consciousness had also created a problem that the return of Christ was precisely the one that could help resolve: the radical loneliness of the modern self. The self that has become independent of the spiritual world, that can no longer simply receive the guidance that spiritual hierarchies offered to the more permeable consciousnesses of earlier ages, is in a position of isolation that is, from a spiritual perspective, deeply dangerous. Not because isolation is permanent or irremediable, but because a self isolated from the spiritual cosmos is exposed to forces that a connected self can recognize and resist, and that an isolated self, without the insight that contact with the Logos offers, can accept for guidance without realizing that it is being led astray. This is why Steiner saw the return of the Christ in the ether not just as a spiritual blessing, but as an urgent evolutionary necessity, because the self that modernity has developed, which is real and valuable and necessary, needs, in order to continue to develop toward what it genuinely is, contact with the Logos that the Earth's etheric field progressively offers, not to lose the independence he gained, to use it in a way that brings about the next level of development, rather than being lost in the sterile sufficiency of a self that has become so independent that it can no longer find the cosmos that constitutes it. The relationship between the return of the Christ in the ether and the development of spiritual perception, between what is happening objectively in the Earth's etheric field and what the inner development of certain souls is making it possible to perceive, has a specificity that most presentations of this theme in popular spiritualities completely miss: the specificity of the ether as a substance. The ether is not the spirit in general. It is a specific plane of reality with specific characteristics that the Logos inhabits in a specific way, and that certain specific spiritual faculties allow it to perceive. And the faculties that allow this perception, what Steiner called imagination, inspiration, and spiritual intuition, in precise technical senses, are faculties that develop through specific practices, not spontaneously. Spiritual imagination, the first level of spiritual perception that development produces, is the ability to perceive the images that the spiritual world forms in the etheric field. Not images produced by fantasy, not images that the desiring self projects, but images that emerge from the etheric field as expressions of real spiritual forces. It is at this level that the return of Christ in the ether begins to become perceptible, as images that have a specific quality, that were not created by the consciousness that perceives them, that arrive with the certainty inherent to what is perceived rather than what is imagined. Spiritual inspiration, on the second level, is the ability to perceive not just the images, but the beings behind the images, the thoughts that spiritual beings think and that developed consciousness can receive as if they were thoughts arriving from outside one's own self. It is at this level that the perception of the Christ in the ether acquires a communicative quality, where what is perceived is not just the presence of the Logos, but something of what the Logos is accomplishing, of the guidance that the Logos offers, of the wisdom that the Logos carries, and that the sufficiently developed soul can begin to receive as real inspiration. Spiritual intuition, the third level, is the ability to perceive not just what a spiritual being thinks, but what he is, to come into real contact with the essence of another being, so that the knowledge gained is the most intimate knowledge there is, knowledge from within. It is at this level that the encounter with the Christ in the ether reaches its most profound form, in which the soul not only perceives the presence of the Logos, but for the time of a moment that could be eternity, experiences what the Logos is from within. It is the level that Paul described when he said, "It is no longer me who lives, but Christ lives in me." Not a theological statement, but the description of a real experience, of the most intimate encounter that is possible between a developed human self and the cosmic Logos. These three levels, imagination, inspiration, intuition, are not states that can be achieved all at once. These are abilities that develop progressively, that first emerge sporadically and imprecisely, and that become more stable, clearer, more available, as the inner work that produces them is practiced regularly and in depth. And the inner work that produces them, which is what Steiner's spiritual science was designed to describe and make methodically accessible, is precisely what the statement, "This is already happening," summons. Not the passive recognition that something is occurring in the spiritual field, but the active decision to work to develop the capacities that allow one to perceive and participate in what is occurring. The perception of the return of the Christ in the ether is, therefore, not something that can be waited for without doing anything, expected as if the cosmos would eventually send a dramatic experience that dispelled any doubt and that required no prior effort. It is something one can work toward, for which inner work is precisely the necessary preparation. And what happens when this work is done seriously and with sufficient depth is that the etheric field that surrounds the human being who practices it progressively becomes more transparent to the forces of Christ that the Earth's etheric field carries, like a crystal that is being polished. The substance was there from the beginning, but what the polishing reveals is what was present, but what the opacity hid. The crystal polished by spiritual practice that allows us to perceive the return of Christ in the ether is not metaphorical. It is, from the perspective of spiritual science, a real modification of the structure of the human being's etheric body. A modification that death does not undo, that karma carries to future incarnations, that is part of the spiritual heritage that the self accumulates throughout the evolutionary process. And each soul that carries out this modification, which makes its etheric field more transparent to the Logos, is contributing to the collective etheric field of humanity being progressively more permeable to what the Earth's etheric field carries from Golgotha. That is why Steiner said, with a clarity that sometimes surprised those who expected more cautious formulations from such a rigorous thinker, that the return of Christ in the ether is the most important question facing humanity in this period of its evolution. Not because it is more urgent than the climate crisis or threats to democracy or any of the other visible challenges that the 21st century presents, but because it is the condition of possibility that these challenges will be met in a way that produces development rather than regression, that humanity will use the crisis to deepen rather than harden, to open rather than close, to find what is most fundamentally human rather than sacrifice it to the urgency of the immediate. The humanity that goes through its greatest challenges without the contact with the Logos that the Earth's etheric field offers is a humanity that navigates in the dark, capable of great intelligence and great efficiency, but without the north that only the Logos can offer. The north of genuine love, of genuine freedom, of the genuine development of each soul for what it most deeply is. And the humanity that goes through these same challenges with increasing contact with the Christ in the ether, with souls progressively more capable of perceiving the Logos and acting on what they perceive, is a humanity that, no matter how difficult the challenges, is being guided from within to the answers that serve development rather than to the answers that serve only immediate comfort. This is already happening. In souls that perceive without being able to completely name what they perceive, in communities that have found ways of life that honor what is fundamentally human, even in a world that systematically threatens it, in spiritual practices that, when genuine, are making their practitioners progressively more transparent to the Logos, in encounters that have the quality of recognition of two souls who mutually perceive the thread of spiritual essence that connects them to the same evolutionary project, in acts of love that have a generosity that does not fit into self-interest, in thoughts that have a life that transcends what the thinker could have generated by himself. In all these places, which are not spectacular but which are real, the return of the Christ in the ether is manifesting itself. And Steiner spent his entire life trying to create in other consciousnesses the capacity to recognize what is already happening, so that recognition becomes conscious participation. And participation consciousness becomes the most fundamentally necessary contribution that any human soul can make to the development of all that exists. The practical dimension, what one does with this understanding, how one consciously collaborates with the process that Steiner described, is the aspect that he never separated from the theoretical dimension. Spiritual science, without spiritual practice, is, for Steiner, like a map without travel, useful to a point, but incomplete in terms of what it was designed to be. And thus, the practice that serves the development of the etheric perception of the Christ has forms that are, at the same time, very specific and very adaptable to the individual circumstances of each life. The most fundamental way, and the one most often underestimated precisely because of its apparent simplicity, is the cultivation of attention. Not attention in the sense of cognitive concentration, although that is part of it. Attention in the sense of being completely present to what is happening, to the qualities of the moment, to the being of those you are with, to the forces operating in the immediate field, to what is revealing itself rather than what is projecting. This quality of attention, which Steiner called the presence of the soul, is what creates in the etheric field of the human being the necessary opening for the forces of the logos to begin to operate. It's like the distinction between trying to listen to music with the radio turned on at high volume and trying to listen to it after turning off all sources of noise. The forces of Christ in the ether are present all the time, but the presence of souls who have not developed attention is so noisy that it prevents the perception of what has always been available. A second practical way is the development of what Steiner called devotion to the small, the ability to bring to the most ordinary acts of life the quality of attention and intention that is normally reserved for great occasions. The way you prepare a meal, the way you listen to a person who is suffering, the way you perform the most repetitive work. All of these acts can be performed in ways that feed or drain the etheric field, depending on the quality of presence you bring to them. When performed with the devotion to the small that Steiner described, with the recognition that the logos that created the universe is present also in the smallest of acts, that each moment of life genuinely lived is a participation in the evolutionary project of the cosmos, they become moments of spiritual practice as real as any formal meditation. A third form is the specific practice of meditation that Steiner elaborated on. Not meditation as an emptying of consciousness, but meditation as a controlled activity of thought. The meditation that serves the development of the etheric perception of the Christ requires that the thinker actively hold a spiritual content, a concept, an image, a gospel text, in the field of consciousness, without letting it associate with other contents, without letting the habitual flow of associations carry it away, with the full active presence that is the mark of living rather than representational thought. This practice, which appears simple but immediately reveals the extent to which habitual thinking is outside the control of the self, progressively modifies the etheric field in ways that make it more transparent to the forces of the logos. And a fourth form, which Steiner placed above all others in terms of importance for the spiritual life in general and for the perception of the Christ in the ether in particular, is what he called active moral force. The deliberate performance of acts that emerge from the recognition of the good, regardless of what circumstances recommend or what personal interest favors. Not obedience to moral rules, which is real but operates on a superficial level. The action that emerges from the genuine perception of what is good in that specific situation, for those specific people at that specific time. The action that the deeper self recognizes as necessary and performs out of that recognized need, regardless of the cost. Each of these acts, each exercise of genuine moral will, creates in the human etheric field a quality that Steiner saw as especially receptive to the forces of the Christ. The quality of love that does not depend on conditions, that operates independently of reward or recognition. The relationship between the perception of Christ in the ether and death, between the encounter that certain souls are experiencing in the etheric field during incarnate life, and what the etheric field reveals when the physical body dies, is an aspect that Steiner addressed with special care, precisely because there is a possibility of confusion here that would be spiritually consequential. The return of the Christ into the ether that he announced is not simply what happens when the self and astral body are freed from the physical body through death, the experience of the spiritual world. Ritual that death normally makes available is not identical to the perception of Christ in the ether during incarnate life. What Steiner described is something that occurs while the human being is still fully alive and conscious, which does not require the state between sleep and wakefulness, although the border of sleep is especially propitious. but which can, in sufficiently developed souls, also occur during full wakefulness. This distinction is important because it indicates the radically new character of what the return of the Christ in the ether represents. Not the perception of the spiritual that death makes available, this humanity has always known, but the perception of the spiritual by waking consciousness, by consciousness that remains oriented in the physical world while simultaneously perceiving the etheric world. It is a dual perception, not the alternating perception that conventional mediumship sometimes produces, in which consciousness oscillates between the physical and the spiritual, but simultaneous perception, in which the full, conscious self is completely present to the physical world, and at the same time, completely present to the etheric field in which the Logos is operating. This dual perception, which is the proper form of clairvoyance for the modern human being, which does not sacrifice the consciousness of the developed self to achieve spiritual perception, is what Steiner saw as the natural product of spiritual development when conducted with the rigor that spiritual science prescribes. What this double perception produces in concrete life, in addition to the changes that have already been described in relationships with suffering, with time, and with others, is something that is perhaps the most difficult to articulate, but which is, for those who experience it, the most immediately recognizable, a quality of certainty about what is fundamentally real, that does not depend on arguments, and that is not shaken by adverse circumstances, not the dogmatic certainty that closes off the possibility of further discovery, which is a form of rigidity, but the living certainty that opens, that no longer needs external confirmations to know that the Logos exists, that the cosmos has an evolutionary project, that evolution has a direction that is good, that each soul matters to that project, in a way that the cosmos recognizes even when the soul does not. This certainty, which is born from the encounter with the Christ in the ether, and which no argument can produce, but which no argument can undo, is what sustains spiritual development in the most difficult periods, what allows the practice to continue when there are no vivid experiences to reward it, what maintains the thread that connects the developed self to the Logos that is its deepest depth. The final question, the most directly personal of all, is, how do I know if I'm getting this? How do I distinguish what Steiner described from any other spiritual state, from any other form of inner experience that could be confused with what he announced?